From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. My name is Mark Smith. I'm the director of the Institute for Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina. And this is our Origins podcast for Take on the South. And what I want to do here is really talk about three origins, if you will. The first is a brief discussion about the origins of the Institute for Southern Study. And then I want to move on to explaining why and what we mean by the title of our podcast, Take on the South. And then finally, I want to say a few words or think about the evolution of the study of the American South over the past several decades. I personally am ill-equipped to do all three, but my guest today, Walter Edgar, is superbly equipped to talk meaningfully about all three, the Institute for Southern Studies, Take on the South, and the state of the field, if you will. Many of you know Dr. Edgar. He is the author of a fabulously influential and popular book, South Carolina History, which I think is in its 8th, 9th, or 10th edition now. I'm simply uncertain, but I know that it's a hit. And of course, many of you listen to him on a regular basis in the capacity as he's the host of Walter Edgar's Journal. That's on South Carolina radio, and that reaches literally millions of ears in South Carolina and North Carolina. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Walter Edgar.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina had its origin back in the mid-1970s. There was a Southern Studies program, a very narrowly focused primarily on literature and a certain view of history. Not that it didn't have some interesting and challenging public programs. For example, they had Time on the Cross with the authors here, which was at the time a very controversial look at the institution of slavery. And it did host C. Van Woodward when he worked on his award-winning book, The Diary of Mary Chestnut.
So these programs were alive and kicking in the 1970s, and you brought these authors to the campus of the University of South Carolina to discuss these, what were nationally important books. I mean, after all, Time on the Cross was on the Today Show.
Now, I was not then the director. It was still called a program, but it was very narrowly focused. It had no real outreach other than, the one program that I mentioned. It was concerned with publishing William Gilmore Simms' Revolutionary War novels and that kind of focus. The provost and the university president asked for an assessment by senior scholars on campus. Professor Tom Conley in history was involved. There were some professors from the English department, political science department, and they entitled their report, Southern Studies, Whither or Whither. And the decision was they didn't want the program to wither. This was under the James Holderman presidency. Frank Borkowski was the provost. Regional studies were beginning to appear everywhere. Our 1975 program actually predated the one at Ole Miss, but the one at Ole Miss really took off and became very, very well known. And so they said, we want to do something here. We want to reach undergraduates. We want to reach a broader community to bring folks here to campus. So they asked me to become the director. We thought we needed an institute for identity purposes, and quite frankly, also to raise money. We went through all the process to going through the Commission on Higher Education, which took about a year. From the very beginning, we had a lot of interest in the community outside the university, because what we began to do immediately, before we could be finally approved, we started a Sunday afternoon program on the South in film. This is Sunday afternoon. We had the largest auditorium on campus, and we would fill it up. The film ranging from Gone with the Wind to Walk Tall to some very obscure early African American films. Each film was introduced and discussed by a scholar on campus. And that's the sort of thing back in the early 1980s, Sunday afternoon, we could get 200 to 300 people to come out for a program. In fact, we hit a Super Bowl afternoon, and we competed with the Super Bowl, and we filled up the auditorium. Now, that's not the kind of program that's going to work in 2020. But reaching out to the community, and this was followed up with, we did a very serious program with Robert Penn Warren, brought in scholars from across the country, and that ended up becoming a book, Southern Renaissance Man, which was published by LSU Press. And again, we had scholars come in, not just to participate, but because of the list of folks who were speaking on Warren, they came in for the program, and then we had an incredible audience from the community, filled up the Gambrell Hall Auditorium for 3 days of discussion of Robert Penn Warren.
So the chances of this happening today are much less, obviously, but it doesn't really suggest that there isn't the same hunger or interest in Southern studies. Is it really a function of technology that has changed this?
Mark, that's it. It's technology. It's what people do with their time. And we were finding this out before I retired from Southern Studies in 2012, was the day, as it were, of having a name lecturer on campus, particularly in the evening, and bringing people in, having people come in. People weren't coming to downtown Columbia. They couldn't park. They couldn't get to the program. Now, we did begin to do a series of programs out at the State Archives, which functioned very, very well. But you think of access, availability of time, and by now, they might come out for an evening program, but whether they'll come out for a whole series of lectures, technologically, they can get what they want on the internet.
Yep, that's entirely right. Which is why, well, one of the reasons that you and I, back in around, 2008, 2009, 2010, decided to sort of shift the technology of outreach. And we ended up really using television to host a series of debates that we quite brilliantly called at the time, Take on the South.
Absolutely, and not only were they successful, produced by South Carolina Educational Television, but the programs were picked up by ETV stations across the country, and not just in the South. And one of those delightful things, we can advertise that was an Emmy award-winning program. It was nominated for content. Sadly, we didn't win that, but we won for set design. That's right.
And we should have won for content, but nonetheless, it was nominated. Let's go back into the kind of the origins of Take on the South, because I remember quite clearly when we came up with it, you and I were having lunch, and we were talking about the precise problems that you just identified. That is to say, you can put on an evening speaker, but there's such fierce competition for people's time that they might or they might not come. How do we make it more accessible for people, and how do we disseminate things Southern? And that's when we came up with Take on the South. And the idea for Take on the South originally, and correct me if I'm wrong, was really to take on the South as a subject, but also to bring in two opposing scholars to debate a particular topic. So they were going to, what was their take on the South? Do you remember some of those topics that we had them discuss?
What was the favorite American sport? Was it football or was it NASCAR?
That's right. And I can't remember who we brought in for that, but I do recall the way that it would work is we would bring in the two scholars, we would go down to SCETV studios, bring in an audience, and it was essentially, it was taped and then edited, but there was a very live feel to it, wasn't there?
Well, yes, and there was audience participation at the end. There were questions from the audience. For example, very serious ones about literature. What's the best Southern novel? And we had the two best scholars in the country that could address that. Everything was, I think, presented at a time and in a format that grabbed people's attention. Otherwise, why would a Kansas City TV station pick up Take on the South?
That's right.
One from the West Coast.
That's right. You had that nice dialectic of scholarly debate, but presented in a way that was accessible, not just to the audience, but to the people who were going to watch it later. I think originally, when we approached the Watson Brown Foundation that subsidized this very generously,
Yes.
the idea was that these debates would make their way into schools and could be viewed by high school students in particular to get access to some of the most important debates about what it means to be Southern. Refresh my memory a bit. We did have the one on Southern sport. Which one was more Southern, NASCAR or college football? Because it couldn't certainly be NFL, that's for sure. We had, which was the most, did we say popular Southern novel or important?
I think we said, no, we said important.
Hey y'all, it's Matt Simmons, the show's producer. Just to let you know, Dr. Edgar and Dr. Smith could not remember the names of the scholars who participated in this debate, so we went back and looked it up. It was the University of Southern Mississippi's Noel Polk, who was championing Faulkner's Absalom Absalom, and the University of Alabama's Trudeau Harris, who was arguing for To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, back to the program.
She chose To Kill a Mockingbird, and during the debate, he talked about the timelessness of Faulkner, and she said, the book I'm supporting never went out of print.
At that point, the debate was shut down. If I remember correctly, I think the audience voted at the end on that one.
Yes, and they did To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, that's right. Do you remember what the audience vote was on NASCAR versus college football?
It was a NASCAR.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Which is ironic since the studios were just 10 feet away from the Williams-Brice football stadium. And what else? We had Stan Engerman in, since we mentioned Time on the Cross. We had Stan Engerman in, and I think it was Peter Koklanis, wasn't it, to debate whether or not Southern slavery is profitable. And that was an interesting debate too, because I think what it did was sort of resurrect that old debate from the 1970s when Genovese and Fogel and Engerman were having it. But it's also very, very relevant today, since that has taken up on the imagination of younger scholars. This question of profitability and its moral freighting is very important. And I think that we did a very good service by having that as one of the edgier debates about taking on the South. Was slavery profitable? And I think we got a lot of feedback on that. People were quite surprised about what was said.
Well, and not only that, and of course, Koklanis' book, Shadow of a Dream, about South Carolina, probably when he brought that book out, and by the way, he was a graduate fellow here at the Institute before he ended up at Chapel Hill. And Shadow of a Dream deals with the foundation of South Carolina, primarily the colonial and antebellum periods, but then he makes a quick flip to the present. He said, is South Carolina headed the same way that the Caribbean colonies had been, and really firmly linked South Carolina with the Caribbean? He said, is it going to be pimps and bellhops economy, meaning basically tourism? And we now need to see what is our favorite, what is our largest segment of the state's economy? It's tourism.
That's right. He wasn't far wrong. This is a good example of an historian being able to speak to contemporary issues, right? And that's where I think Southern Studies has real resonance. Because it's multi and interdisciplinary, it manages to capture the texture of a problem beyond its time, right? So it's kind of transcendent. And I think Koklanis is a great example of that. And I think all of those Take on the South debates had precisely that signature, that it resonated with people today. It wasn't something just captured in the past. It spoke to their modern conceits, their modern concerns.
Absolutely. And I think we need to mention here the Southern Studies Forum, which is an international consortium of European and American scholars dealing with various aspects of the American South. And the only time it's ever been held in the United States has been at the Institute for Southern Studies, and we did that twice. But again, it's truly interdisciplinary, and that was what I think was the big difference between the Southern Studies program as it was founded here in 1975 and the change we made with the Institute. We brought in geography, political science, sociology, economics, as well as history and literature.
Now your fingerprints are on that. That you created that interdisciplinary approach. Not to say that you invented it, but you certainly made Southern Studies that interdisciplinary project that it is today. And I think people would be quite interested to know why, right? Because you're an historian by training, but what was it in your training that gave you that impetus, that desire to bring in economics, to bring in anthropology. In fact, one of the last hires we made was thoroughly interdisciplinary, and that is we had a hire between Southern Studies and the School of Public Health. And you were behind that. That was your idea. How did you get to that way of looking at Southern Studies as opposed to just a Southern History project?
Because I thought the Southern History project was boring. I'm serious. My graduate work focused on the colonial period, and even though my dissertation was, I'll say it was cultural because it was on the libraries of colonial South Carolina, and so I got into who was selling books. It dealt with who could afford to buy the books, and going through the inventories of estates, finding how important books were to South Carolinians. That was kind of the beginning. But I also had a very good undergraduate professor at Davidson College who taught something called American Cultural History. And it was across the board. We studied everything from opera to Broadway plays to the theater. It was literature, politics. It was a fascinating course. And once the idea of the Institute was broached with colleagues in geography, Chuck Kovacic, for example, John Weirberry, who are no longer at the university, were very much a part of that. Blease Graham in political science, scholars in the English department, fellows in the history department. And interestingly, one of the biggest earliest supporters of Southern Studies was the late John Dolan, who was a medievalist, but he loved the broader cultural scene. And undergraduates took to the idea of Southern Studies as an interdisciplinary major. It was kind of serendipitous. Once we put out the fact that we were no longer just doing this rather stodgy history and literary program, we got lots of positive feedback and participation from the undergraduates, from fellow faculty, and from the community.
Yeah, because I think that's the point, isn't it? I mean, it started to reflect the reality of everybody's fabric. I mean, people don't just exist in an historical context or a literary one. They're cultural. They're thoroughly cultural creatures. And I do think that your dissertation was precisely the origins of this, because when you're talking about books are many things to different people, aren't they? They're private possessions, they're public statements. You're really talking about the sociology of knowledge. And you're talking about, a kind of way of looking at the world. So to me, it never really was a shock that you'd be really interdisciplinary. But to some people, they sort of scratch their heads because they know that, as the author of South Carolina history, the definitive historical treatment of this state, I think it was just in this historian. But if you read that book carefully, you will see all of these interdisciplinary inflections brought to bear in that book. When I read the manuscript many years ago, I think I said to you, Walter, this is more than just a history book. This is something that will speak beyond its moment. And I think I was right. And I think people, when they read it today, see this book as something more than just history.
Well, among the things that I discovered that I think may have sparked this, there were South Carolinians before the American Revolution who had standing orders with book dealers in London for the latest British magazine. So as quick as something was published, it was put on a ship and came out here to South Carolina.
Well, I can't blame them, being an avid connoisseur of British things myself. But yeah, yes,
But and so that, when all of a sudden you find bound copies of the Tatler and other, the Gentleman's Magazine, for which, by the way, South Carolinians wrote. They published articles. They belonged to the Royal Society for the Promotion of Arts, Manufacturing, and Commerce. This Atlantic world that we take for, everybody knows about it now, but nobody back in the 1960s was talking about an Atlantic world. And even connecting South Carolina to the Caribbean, I was going out on a limb doing that. George Rogers thought it was there, but it had not really moved out until Jack Green.
Yeah, and now you can't teach the history of South Carolina without talking about those Caribbean connections, which are terribly important.
And the influence of South Carolina on the rest of the development of the American South, which is something historians and other scholars have gotten it. I'm still not sure that the general public understands how important South Carolina was in terms of the development of economic institutions, the whole idea of the plantation economy. Not that there weren't large-scale enslaved populations in other southern states, but the model came out of South Carolina.
Yep, you're certainly right. Could you tell us what you're working on now?
Yes, I'm working on a new history of South Carolina with Brent Morris, who teaches at USC Beaufort. I call Brent a former student. He was an undergraduate, but he got his graduate training up north because as an undergraduate, I told him if he wanted a job in South Carolina, he really needed to go out of, and so he went to Cornell. An incredible young scholar, primarily of Reconstruction and modern South Carolina. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a book of South Carolina since World War II, because the South Carolina history was published in 1998, which meant the research stopped 2 years earlier. And historically, that means it's been a generation, 25 years, since anybody has looked at that period. So we're really going to look at the formation of contemporary South Carolina. My favorite chapter is going to be the last chapter. That we're working on all of it together, but the last chapter is mine, and it's going to be called South Carolina 352, because it'll be 352 years since English settlement. So comparison, South Carolina population 1940, 2021. Demographics, where are they from? The percentage of folks who are now communes and not beignets, as folks in the Low Country would say. All of this has had a tremendous impact on the state. V.O. Key said that South Carolina politics was of friends and neighbors, which was the old, what politicians used to say, it's all local. Well, it's not. Every election is a national, whether it is for school board or governor. As late as the 1960s, to have outsiders endorse a candidate was the kiss of death. To have a governor who was not a native was unheard of. A lot of things that people thought were still there in 1995, that South Carolina isn't there anymore. It's changed. There's still a very special South Carolina, but it's a different one from the one that when I moved here in 1965, or the one that my wife Neela, who is that rarity, a native Colombian, grew up in.
Yeah, so I think that this book is going to be very important. It's being published by the University of South Carolina Press, is that correct?
That's correct.
And when's it due out, do you know?
Well, pre-COVID, we were going to stop in December 2020. Obviously, the impact of COVID on the state is still happening, but we knew by midsummer 2020 that we can't stop a book here. We need to have a period of reflection on how things has changed. It's supposed to come out 2023. I'm still a little bit hesitant about shutting off the research right now, because as we're recording this, COVID is spiking again. You've got something unheard of, I'd say in the past. The Attorney General makes an opinion and tells the Mayor of Columbia, what y'all have done is illegal, so the mayor said, sue me.
Mm-hmm. And it's making national news,
and that's making national news. You have, in the Low Country, school districts saying, we're going to do this anyway.
Incredible irony, all of this, isn't it? A sort of radical devolution of authority in a state that once championed that.
It's not, yes, not only that, but I think local governments reacting against the government in Columbia the way the government in Columbia reacts against Washington. You know, once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back.
There's a kind of odd poetry there, isn't there?
Yes.
So ultimately, it sounds to me that this book is going to have a real fidelity to your original dissertation. And that is, it's going to be not just a history, but it's going to be a commentary and a sociology about the present, about how the past has informed the present, and about some of the problems that aren't historically grounded necessarily, but have just popped up in a particular moment at a particular time. Walter Edgar, thank you so much for joining us, and you've really helped, I think, explain what Take on the South is and what Take on the South will be.
Mark, it's been my pleasure to be back here, the first time I've been back in Southern Studies since 2012.
Welcome back. That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.